Solomon is inspired to flee on his way to the store, but he stumbles into a lynching. His spirit is broken after witnessing the fate of the two men, but he continues to the store. The movie begins with a group of slaves that are being taught how to cut sugar cane. A man lazily observes the men's work while perched atop a wagon filled with raw cane root. The setting changes to a collection of shacks. Slaves are currently eating. Solomon Northup is motivated to develop ink and a quill after observing the dark juice of blackberries. Unfortunately, the plan doesn't work. Juice is far too thin. Later, a woman stirs in her sleep in the cramped slave quarters and makes a sexual advance at Northup, using his hand as leverage. Finally, the title card flashes as Solomon remembers happier days spent with his wife and kids. We get glimpses into Solomon's life as a free man. He is a talented violinist in high demand in his hometown of Saratoga. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, he talks with his wife, who will soon take the kids with her to work as a cook. He mockingly expresses his resentment at being deprived of her cooking. The following morning, he sends them off in a carriage. Later that day, he runs into a friend who introduces him to Brown and Hamilton, two strangers who say they work for a traveling circus. They guarantee he will return before his wife does and offer him a large sum of money to travel with them to Washington, D.C. So naturally, he consents to go with them. The group is next seen dining in a D.C. restaurant. His customers give him a bag of larger coins than the amount they had promised. They both drink wine, and one of them keeps a close eye on Solomon while he finishes his. The good times are being had by all. Solomon awakens abruptly while shackled to the floor of a dingy jail. His friends bring him to his hotel room in a succession of flashbacks, explaining his inebriated state to other guests. Brown tells Hamilton that time is running out, and they need to get this over with. The flashback concludes with their departure. We rejoin Solomon in the cell, where he is informed that he is a runaway Georgia slave. He has no papers, despite his protests of being a free man. Solomon is beaten mercilessly and eventually thrown into a slave pen with others. He discusses his dilemma with Clemens, an apparently educated slave who advises him on the gravity of their situation. Soon after, a mother, Eliza, and her daughter are brought to the pen to join a captured son. She tries to keep a brave face while realizing the impending tragedy. They are dragged from their cell, chained, and transported to a riverboat under darkness. They are led to the hold, which is already crammed with other human cargo. Clemens reiterates his recommendation that Solomon keeps a low profile and deny his ability to read and write. They come across another slave, Robert, who wishes to revolt and seize control of the ship. They weigh their options before deciding to be cautious. Later that night, a slaver arrives at the hold and awakens Eliza to rape her. When Robert tries to stop the rape, he is stabbed and killed. Clemens and Solomon are accused of disposing of the body in the river, prompting Clemens to remark that Robert is better off dead. They eventually arrive at a dock. Clemens' master is waiting for them and demands the return of his stolen property immediately. Clemens gratefully scampers into his master's embrace, abandoning all evidence of his previously demonstrated intellect. Solomon's only friend has died. A slaver, ironically named Freeman, calls his new property to their feet after disembarking by announcing their names. He addresses Solomon as Platt, which he clearly does not recognize. Solomon receives a slap for denying the name. As naked slaves bathe in buckets at Freeman's offices, the indignity of his slave operation is on display. Inside, he delivers his sales pitch to eager customers. A wealthy plantation owner, Ford, expresses an interest in Platt and Eliza. She begs him to take her children as well, but Freeman refuses and quickly sells her son to another buyer. Ford tries to buy her daughter, clearly of mixed ancestry, but Freeman refuses to lower his price. Finally, Ford can only afford 2 of them. Eliza is distraught and screams angrily, disrupting the sale. To lighten the mood, Solomon is instructed to play the fiddle. Ford returns his purchases to his plantation. Eliza has been sobbing the entire journey. Finally, Ford's wife says that food and a good night's sleep will help her forget them. The slaves are introduced to T. Beats, a slave handler, and Ford's overseer, Chapin, the following morning. As the slaves work, T. Beats sings a mocking song warning them not to flee. They continue chopping wood until they come across a small band of native people with whom they share a brief respite. Solomon notices a stringed instrument and recalls his own violin. The following day, Solomon approaches Ford with a creative plan to ship the logs by the river, despite Clement's advice. Although T. Beats is incredibly patronizing, Ford is won over by Solomon's viewpoints and is persuaded. T. Beats is humiliated after the plan is successful. Ford rewards Solomon with a violin to play. Eliza is lamenting the loss of her children back at the slave quarters. Solomon debates with her about enduring Ford's good treatment after becoming irritated by the noise. Ford must undoubtedly be aware that Solomon is not a slave, but Eliza counters that Ford does nothing to free him. It causes Solomon to hesitate. Ford's wife eventually sells Eliza because she can't stand the noise. Over the following few days, T. Beats tries to exact small-scale retaliation against Solomon, which results in an argument. T. Beats tries to defeat Solomon, but Solomon fights back and prevails. T. Beats is forced to flee when Chapin enters the scene. He cautions that if he runs, he cannot protect him and makes it seem like he would have Ford fix it. Later, we learn that T. Beats has assembled thugs to lynch Solomon for having the audacity to challenge him. When Chapin returns with his weapons drawn, they have the rope around his neck and are getting ready to hang him. He chases them away but permits Solomon to stand there on tiptoes, hardly able to maintain himself, as punishment for striking a white man. Slaves gradually emerge from their huts, but they don't seem to care about his situation. Finally, water is covertly brought to him by a woman, who immediately leaves. After hours, Ford returns and cuts the rope to free Solomon. He drags him inside the house for protection but ultimately decides that he must be sold. However, T. Beats won't relinquish his right to retaliation. In this passage, we discover that Ford had sold Solomon to Epps, a renowned plantation owner with a history of brutal beatings. Epps reads a verse from the Bible while skewing the text to support his claim to ownership of the slaves. The day of cotton picking is the next day. The weight of each worker's bundles is noted at the end of the day. The yield of Solomon is below average. Slaves who made fewer selections than the previous day are lashed. While Patsy produces nearly twice as much as the most excellent worker. Patsy is circled by Epps as he lavishes praise on her. He clearly finds her fascinating, which makes his wife unhappy. When Epps enters the slave quarters and wakes them up, an impromptu dance is performed with Patsy at the center. Epps' wife physically scars Patsy by hurling a large crystal decanter at her face. She insists that Epps sell Patsy, but he refuses, saying he would rather lose Patsy than his wife. Mistress Epps dispatches Solomon on a shopping trip. She gives him a list and observes him reading it. She emphasizes that he should not do it again. Solomon is inspired to flee on his way to the store, but he stumbles into a lynching. His spirit is broken after witnessing the fate of the two men, but he continues to the store. Seeing the paper, he brings a spare sheet with him every time so he can write a letter. Later, Epps sends Solomon to a Shaw plantation in the area. Shaw raised the status of one of his slaves by marrying her. Patsy is visiting and taking in the finery, but it seems that Epps is envious that Shaw could try to seduce her. After a short period of relaxation, Solomon persuades Patsy to follow him. They get back to Epps' plantation, and he's obviously inebriated. Patsy hears Solomon urging her to stay away from Epps in a whisper, which Epps misinterprets as sexual arousal. Mistress Shaw steps in after a wild pursuit around the yard, if only to voice her disapproval at her husband's fixation on Patsy. Epps wanders to the slave quarters later that evening and rapes her. Mistress Shaw reprimands Patsy for her husband's adultery before brutally slicing her face. Later that evening, Patsy begs Solomon to kill her by hanging her and burying her body. She cannot continue bearing the weight of Epps' rapes and his wife's suffering. She begs Solomon to accept, but he refuses. Because of Solomon's talent, the judge suggests him to a neighbor looking for music for a party. The justices also ruled that Solomon was allowed to keep his earnings. Solomon can readily draw comparisons between his forced servitude and his former existence as a free man at the fancy costume ball. It's time to head back to Epps' farm now that the celebration has ended. Patsy's bloodied eye suggests that her tortures have continued as Solomon approaches the house. Back to the fields now that the cotton crop has been harvested. This time, a white laborer named Armsby joins them. He is picking to make money to get back on his feet. Despite producing significantly less than any other worker, he is exempt from the lashing that all other slaves must endure. He attends to Solomon's wounds and shares his tale in the quarters. He seems like a good man with a sympathetic ear. Solomon decides to take a chance by entrusting him with mailing a letter to the north to win his freedom. He hands Armsby all of the party proceeds and swears him to silence. In 2 days, he will deliver the letter to him. After making ink, Solomon begins to write the letter. Just that evening, Epps walks Solomon outdoors after entering the quarters. Armsby breached his promise and revealed it all to Epps. Thankfully, he narrated his tale before Solomon handed him the letter. Thinking swiftly and capitalizing on Epps' disdain for slaves, he turns the narrative around. He accuses Armsby of lying and trying to gain favor to secure a job. Solomon is spared after Epps is convinced by this tale. Later, after burning the letter, Solomon sees his chances for freedom vanish in the ashes. Later, they come across a group of laborers using Base as a hired hand to build a structure. Base comes from the north and has strong anti-slavery beliefs, contrasting with Epps' staunch pro-slavery views. The chit-chat going on in front of Solomon caught his attention. Later, Epps gets all worked up over Patsy. Epps believes she has fled away because she has vanished. She has only returned to Shaw's plantation to see her buddy, despite his threats to harm all the ladies because of her loss. She tries to persuade Epps that she is loyal to him and that she went there to purchase some soap, a luxury that Epps' wife has refused her. Solomon is left alone with the hired hand, Base. He inquires about where he is from, and when Base responds, Canada, Solomon demonstrates convincing knowledge of the country. Solomon explains his dire situation when Base asks how he's so well traveled. Base comes to believe Solomon's story and recognizes the terrible injustice. As they continue to work, Solomon takes a risk and asks Base to write letters to his Saratoga friends. Now we see a group of men tilling the soil and planting seeds. A carriage arrives at the Epps plantation, and an official-looking man calls out for Platt Solomon. He responds and approaches the man, a sheriff. The man asks him some questions and motions to another man in the carriage. It's Mr. Parker, a Saratoga shop owner and friend of Solomon's. With little further prodding, the sheriff is persuaded, and Solomon rushes to embrace his friend. Epps is enraged and yells empty threats. The sheriff refutes the arguments, and Parker assists Solomon in boarding the carriage that will transport him to safety. Patsy, who is present, calls to him. To give her one final embrace before leaving, Solomon leaps from the carriage. He walks away, and Patsy collapses in tears. Solomon has now been brought inside. He is filled with emotion as he stands outside his door after being rescued from his nightmare. He sees his family as soon as he walks in. Despite being 12 years older, they were shocked to see him. The son of his daughter and her husband is known as Solomon Northup. The movie ends as they surround him and welcome him home as tears stream down their faces. He tried to sue his kidnappers but was unsuccessful, as is stated in a series of title cards. So instead, Northup developed as an abolitionist who helped several fugitives gain freedom.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.